Right, hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for one of the last panel discussions of the day. This panel is about self-harm, risk and relationships. As we heard this morning, so many children, not just in CAMHS, but also in specialist services. The CSA Centre report and safeguarding review found also that the voluntary sector is turning children away from therapeutic spaces around the idea of what risk means, being too high risk. Self-harm, suicidal thoughts, suicidal behaviours are a consequence of traumatic experiences, and we really need to unpick the concept of risk and maybe start from a different place. So to start this session, we have a film to show you from one of our young people who participated in the film group in the Voice programme, if any of you were there earlier. Her words to describe the movie. The movie is based off the Soviet cartoons I watched when I was little on the Lithuanian cable TV. I was only 8. They were my solace, my only distraction from the strange ways my stepfather was touching me. It's bittersweet looking back at the shows. So I'm going to invite you to watch now the film from our young person, and then I will introduce our panel. Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to welcome to the stage our panellists and introduce you to our very fabulous chair, Duncan Craig from We Are Survivors. He will introduce you to everybody else and talk about his fabulous nail varnish. Thank you.
Look at that. 23 quid. Hard as nails. Let me just tell you about this first, because I'm so, if I'm gesturing a lot, it's kind of because I've got nail varnish on and I feel like, hey, look at me. So Hard as Nails, if you go to the website, I think it's hardasnails.co.uk. This week, there's 300 men across the UK who have painted their nails. I would like to say, I went for a manicure and had my nails painted. I discovered there's this thing called cuticles. I'm fully aware that this is nothing to do with this panel, but and I had all my cuticles sorted. 300 men have had their nails painted, and we are doing a research project, and we are literally recording the response from the public and the response from friends and family and the looks that we're getting, and we're trying to smash the patriarchy and begin to start thinking about gender norms and how toxic gender norms are. So, yeah, go and have a look. I feel like Lady Gaga. Anyway, thank you. And thank you to Gemma and Candice for inviting me, but also thank you for Gemma for allowing me to talk about my nails. We could just forget this and just talk about my nails, but we won't. What we'll do instead is we'll do a few introductions. So my name's Duncan Craig. I'm the founder and chief executive of We Are Survivors. We Are Survivors is now the largest service in the UK supporting male victims, male survivors of sexual harms. We've just changed our language. So we used to say sexual abuse, rape and sexual exploitation, and we now say sexual harms, because I am desperate for our language to be way more inclusive than it's been. Partly through my own experience as a survivor. So much of my experience when I was looking for help, people were saying that I wasn't the right type of survivor through my healing journey. And so I want to always make sure that we are being extremely inclusive. And also, when I talk about male survivors, I'm talking about all males, regardless of what somebody's assigned gender at birth was. And I'm also talking about the men who are in our prison service as well, people who have committed sexual offences, who are also survivors, and also people who have committed other offences that are currently in prison, who are survivors. We have a phrase and a vision of ensuring that no male survivor is left behind, and we really are going to stick to that. So that's pretty much all you're going to hear from me. Let me introduce you to Cara.
Thank you. Hi everybody, I'm Cara Donald. I'm the area manager for England Central for Papyrus, the prevention of young suicide. So Papyrus is a national organisation that supports people under the age of 35 who are struggling with thoughts of suicide, as well as offering support to concerned others, so often parents, carers, siblings, friends. We have a 24-hour hope line, which is as I said, 24-hour, 7 days a week, which is a suicide prevention helpline, and you can access that through telephone, text, email, web chat, lots of different ways, and it's there to offer support both to young people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide, but also concerned others, and also professionals who might be working with children and young people who are looking at how they have those conversations around suicide and suicide prevention. So I started at Papyrus last year, and prior to that I worked within domestic abuse and sexual violence services for about 10 years, and there is a huge crossover in terms of victim survivors and suicide prevention. Vast majority of people who've been subjected to sexual violence or sexual harms have struggled with thoughts of suicide at some point or another, and people who've been subjected to sexual abuse as children are more likely to be experience thoughts of suicide at some point in their life. So it's great that I've been invited to be here. I really appreciate being able to be involved in this conversation.
Thank you. Next up, Mia.
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I've just been really affected today actually to be around so many people that care about sexual abuse and about mental health and well-being in children and families. So I'm a psychologist and I'm trained in trauma-focused CBT, but I'm not a practicing psychologist. Instead, I run trainings that support trauma-informed facilitation. And then I also am a tutor on a master's at UCL, which is psychology and trauma. But then I also run, so I'm a bit of a chameleon and like to be in different sort of spaces and interact with different types of people. And so I also have an app that provides well-being and parenting support for dads. And the idea is if you can sort of support dads, you can support children, and dads can support their partners, whether they're same-sex partners or heterosexual partners. And so we do, even though, so I wouldn't say sexual abuse is a core part of what Fatherly supports dads with, but it definitely comes up a lot as well. So that's me, and a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And then, last but certainly not least, Dan.
Hello. I'm feeling quite nervous, so I'm just going to read this out. So hi, I'm Dan. I live in Bristol and I'm one of the parents in the Greenhouse's parent voice group. And, as we've already heard this morning, the Greenhouse is there to support survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and for the last 3 years has focused on children and families rather than adult survivors. And since I first came across the Greenhouse about 2 years ago, achieving that focus has changed, and Greenhouse has, as we've heard this morning, widened the kinds of therapy it offers, and has also offered support by building groups that aren't directly therapeutic but offer opportunities for young people to create and be alongside each other, and similar but separate opportunities for parents and carers. And the Parent Voice Group is one group that, with the Young People's Voice Group, was set up to help Greenhouse shape this changing focus, and also to help and critique some of the resources that the Greenhouse has developed, like some of the things we've heard already, the parent podcasts, the schools, sexual abuse and support guidance, and the Turn Up Tuesday drop-in sessions that, unsurprisingly, are on Tuesday mornings. We meet most months, and Ali normally has a packed agenda for us that will include things like the programme for this festival, the contents in a new leaflet, and talking points for an upcoming meeting with Bristol City Council social workers or such like. And I find the group incredibly fulfilling, but also sometimes incredibly depleting, particularly when individually or collectively we're facing institutional indifference or cruelty towards the young people that we know and support. And I'm so impressed with everyone at the Greenhouse. I have got a whole load of adjectives here, but since I've been here today, there's a couple more to add as well. But for their bravery, vitality, wisdom and overwhelming desire to say yes to opportunities. I think curiosity is the word that came up this morning that I think is also a really key word. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. So thanks for coming.
Thank you. Can a round of applause for our panel? So, I'm just going to go and stand over there so I'm not looking away. So, according to what you've got in your brochure, I wanted to make sure that we touch on some of that, but I also don't want this to be a panel where you hear us talking and you sit and watch. It's not a lecture. If you want to do that, I've just said I'll perform a live action The Lion King. That's what I thought I could do. We came up with the idea of getting a therapy dog. I could stand on here, we could hold it up. So I want it to be much more interactive. So please feel free to ask questions, make comments as we go through. When I was thinking about how to kind of start this, I was looking through the brochure, and this really kind of leapt out at me really as a really good starting point. That children and young people who have experienced sexual abuse are 3 times more likely to attempt suicide in adulthood, and a quarter report self-harming behaviours at the point of referral. Recent research also suggests that over 1/3 of young people are turned away from CAMHS. I still think it's really sad that it doesn't matter where I go in the country, and honestly, where I go in the world, we might not call it CAMHS in different countries, but effectively it still is CAMHS. I'm yet to hear an area, a territory, where people are not talking like CAMHS is broken. And I just think that's such a tragedy. We need to do something so desperately about that. And so, I think all of us are in complete agreement. Well, I know all of us are in a complete agreement that children and young people, that survivors, have to be front and centre of these conversations. It might come as a bit of a surprise, but I quite like being front and centre. Anybody surprised? No? Okay. Just checking. So, let's talk. What I want to do first of all is I want to bring Dan in to talk a little bit and to give you a little bit of a story.
Okay, yeah. So I think this story is partly what led to this panel, and so it kind of starts with one of my children, before disclosure, made a serious attempt at suicide and ended up in hospital. And then 3 days after getting back from hospital, so less than a week from when this had all happened, he was adamant that he wanted to go and stay with this new friend that he'd made, who I'd never met, knew nothing about, but he was really adamant that he wanted to go and stay with them. And I was just, incredibly nervous and kind of thought, well, if it's the other way and it was someone coming to me, I'd really want to know that this had happened, and all of that. So I really wanted. So my sort of instinct was to say no, and to sort of and still have a very good friend who's a social worker, and a children's social worker, and she concurred with that point of view, that this was sort of a dangerous thing to do, a risky thing to do, and along the way, I think at hospital I'd been given the number for Papyrus, so I thought, well, I'll phone them, thinking, well, they'll help, there's someone there who'll be able to help me kind of frame the conversation that I need to have with my son, to sort of, to explain why this, can't really happen. So I phoned up Papyrus, and what was really amazing was that it was the person I spoke to was the person who helped. It wasn't a kind of, oh, well, that sounds awful, we'll get someone to phone you back, or, it was the actual person I spoke to. And where we got to at the end of that phone call was that actually the whole risks around this are a lot more complicated than your perspective suggests, and actually the key thing is to make sure with your son that whatever he chooses to do, that he's safe, and that if he is, the opinion was definitely that he should be able to go, rather than that he should be prevented from going, and that he needed to be unable to do that, and plans could be put into place for how to kind of deal with, if something happened, how we could kind of extricate him or support him or whatever. And so he did go. I mean, he's not friends with that person anymore, but it was a very profound moment for me to have had that encounter and to kind of think about it in a wider way. So thanks.
Hearing that story, kind of, for me, I guess it kind of makes me think, as when I was that boy, I wish there was something that somebody would, a helpline that somebody could have rang, a helpline that I could have rang, but there wasn't, and so it feels like we're really lucky to have organisations like Papyrus. So what's it like for you, Cara, hearing that?
It's really great to hear that it's made such an impact. Contacting, it's always great to hear that the work we're doing is making a difference in that way, and offering that level of support, not just to the young people who are accessing the support, but also to those around them. And I think it's a really good example of the approach that we take around safety planning with young people. So one of the things that's quite different around the Hope Line is that the focus is purely around suicide prevention, for one, and that they will go through safety planning with the young person, but it is very much a collaborative safety plan. So one of the issues that I kind of have around risk and risk management from a lot of services, and sometimes it's more around statutory services, but we do see this within the voluntary sector and third sector as well, is that it's around the management of risk from the adult's perspective. And if we're always looking at it from the adult's perspective and their concerns, then not only are we going to miss risks, but also the young person's not going to be on board with the management of what we perceive as to be the risks. So the way that Papyrus will do safety planning with a young person is we'll have that, and the way that we train other professionals, and also the way that we talk to parents or carers or whoever, is that it has to be something that's done collaboratively, and it has to come from them, what they know themselves, what will keep them safe from their thoughts of suicide, and they need to be able to offer those up in a safe space and have those conversations, and that's the best way to have that, for them to have that autonomy and that investment in keeping themselves safe from in that moment when they may be struggling so much with thoughts of suicide that they're looking at kind of plans and action. If they're just told at that moment, well, you know, this is what you need to do, there isn't that level of investment there, and having those choices, which was talked about a lot in one of the previous panels, having those choices is always going to be the best option, particularly when we're talking about children and young people who are survivors of abuse, because in all of those situations, those choices at some point have been taken away from them. So we need to do whatever we can within those conversations to provide and give those choices back to them, and that autonomy over their bodies, because essentially when we're talking about suicide prevention, again, that is what it is. It's autonomy over your own body and keeping yourself safe from yourself, and they need to be involved in that conversation, and they need to be leading that conversation.
Can I get involved?
Of course you can. Knock yourself out, love. Yeah.
Before I move on, because Dan, I just have to say the fact I felt love in what you said, and for me that's the biggest thing. So I'm always excited by dads, and I'm so excited that you're so nervous and you're sitting here with your book and reading it. But what I find so astounding is the call, and many parents would be so afraid to hear the information that was given and to actually listen. Because the listening is the most scary thing to do, and then do it is unbelievable. So I think your work is amazing, and I think you are a brilliant father to have given space to something so hard and to offer that choice to your child. So before it went missing, I had to grab it and say, you.
I mean, just to respond to that, I think part of it is because one of my other children has a lifelong and life-limiting condition. She's an adult now, and you know, if she was here, you wouldn't know it to look at her. But and I think grappling with that over the years has really made me think about risk in a different way. So I think I was very receptive to that conversation when it was had, because I've been in other situations where that was necessary.
I think you're right, Candy. I really do. I think it's an extraordinary, I mean, like literally, like an extraordinary thing for a parent to do. I don't know. It feels like it shouldn't be, but it is. But for me, when you were talking, then I was thinking about professionals, and actually, professionals often are feeling the strain of, to coin a phrase, covering their own arse, whilst also sometimes that's not necessarily the right decisions to be making. And Mia, talk to us about professionals and risk. And
so I think, a lot of people mentioned today about the language that we use, and I think language is really important when we think about risk, and actually the language of high risk. If you tell a young person they're high risk, that's a horrible thing to say to anyone. No one wants to be thought of as a high risk person. And so if there's other ways, the actual language that professionals can use can be really damaging. But at the same time, there's very real and very present risks that they're trying to kind of navigate effectively. And I think someone mentioned today about how sometimes someone won't be given treatment because they're not stable enough. So for trauma, the NICE recommended, so the NICE guidelines or the evidence-based treatment for trauma is trauma-focused CBT. So there's loads and loads of studies, meta-analyses that show that that is an effective treatment, and people can recover from PTSD and have less PTSD symptoms by having that treatment. But if a therapist thinks, or a psychologist, or clinical psychologist or psychiatrist thinks that the person isn't stable enough to go through that therapy, then they will say that they have to do stabilisation work before they can begin those sessions. And it's CBT, so like someone was saying before, it might just be 10 sessions or 20 sessions. But the problem is, if people don't do what you say, if sometimes therapists or psychologists can be not acting in a trauma-informed way. So if they actually say, no, so you might have waited 3 years on CAMHS, you've finally got your appointment to me that you've been thinking about for years, and actually I can't help you, that's a way of possibly re-traumatising them again. Whereas if they do like what Cara is saying and give choices, okay, so we're not ready to do trauma-focused CBT because we're not yet stable enough, so I'm not confident that you will cope if we reenact and go through those traumatic memories again. And that's why they say you can't do it, because they think the person might not be able to cope, that their brain, their nervous system won't be able to handle it, they might not be able to cope outside of the sessions. And then sometimes they might get that decision wrong, and sometimes they might get it right. So I think they're not doing it from a bad intention, but if they don't have the approach, like you were saying, of giving choices to the young person, they might inadvertently make that young person feel hopeless, make them feel suicidal, make them feel like there's no one's going to help them and they're alone.
And I know you said about nice guidelines, but nice guidelines, particularly in what we now call talking therapies, what we used to call IAPT, nice guidelines were very much about single incident trauma within the first 3 years of point of incident, etc. And for me, we're at beyond therapy, like how we move beyond that very kind of rigid idea of an individual fitting into a box. The thing about putting young people, survivors, at the front and centre, co-production of a safety plan you talked about before, that thing about like kind of how do we make sure that we're involving. NICE doesn't think about these kind of things, as we all know. What NICE is thinking about is the kind of the evidence base on scores and numbers. And sometimes I think, and I say this as a psychotherapist as well, so I have to my bias here. Sometimes I think we lose a humanness and a messiness of human beings when we put things into these very clean, rigid ways of doing things. And I think the co-production bit of a professional, a parent, like co-producing with the young person a way of, okay, how do we get from here to here, is messy as anything and yet wonderful as well at the same time. And I think therapists often, particularly in our sector, often want to do that, often want to kind of get involved with the messiness and not have this very rigid way of thinking and of doing.
Can I add something?
Of course you can.
Yeah. I think as well with that, I think that sometimes we can be very focused on people accessing a service, completing the service, and then never having to access a service again, and it being, right, that person's healed, they're done, but we've checked them off. But we're much more complicated than that as human beings. We go through ups and downs throughout our lives, and I think we need to bring back, or not bring back, but create a normality to people accessing support at the points in their life where they need to access support, whether that's once every 2 years, whether that's once every 5 years, whether that's once and then they never need to again, whether that is for a longer period of time, and being more flexible in that approach and not making people feel inadequate or guilty for needing to access support when they've accessed it previously, with this idea, well you had CBT before, so that should be it now, you should be done. And that kind of goes along with that, again, offering choice and offering a kind of more human approach and a messier approach.
Yeah.
I think that's sometimes forgotten, and I think that's often due to overwhelming services as well. It's very difficult when we don't have the capacity to support everybody, but it shouldn't be seen as a failure to access support at different points in your life when you need it.
I wish we would, just as a whole, I wish we would move beyond the idea of what therapy is and think about it in a personal development way. So, what did I say? Oh yeah, chair's privilege. I was at this conference the other week, and this guy that was the chair said, I'm not going to speak, and then wanted to butt in, and then said chair's privilege, and I thought, I'm going to say that. I don't even know if it's appropriate, but I'm just going to say it. When I first made my disclosure, I was 29, I think. So it had been like 15 years since the first part of the abuse had kind of stopped by that person. And I remember thinking, right, okay, I'll go in. There'll be this old woman. It was a guy. I was quite surprised. She's probably got a cardie on. I wear cardies now. And she's got like a pearl necklace, and I'll have a cup of tea, and she'll say some magic stuff, and then I'll walk out and I'll be fixed. Newsflash, didn't really work like that. And as I began to engage in therapy, I remember leaving my therapist's office and thinking, I want to do that. I want to do that thing, and I don't know what it is. And it's not like she hasn't done some magic stuff. It's like she's held this space, and it always stuck with me. And actually getting in the messiness in the space isn't a beginning, a middle and an end. And actually, NHS England has, it's called SAS, Sexual Assault and Abuse Services, strategic plan. It was written, probably about 8-9 years ago now, and hopefully we're going to refresh it. That talks about lifelong service, and what that means is not that you go into service and you just stay forever, but you just go in and you come out, and you go in and you come out whenever you want it. And I remember when I was leaving Steve, so my very first kind of, probably one of the most important men that I've ever had in my life, actually, my therapist at the time. I remember him telling me, like, imagine trying to kind of climb Mount Everest in one go without stopping and taking a breather. And I thought, where's Mount Everest? Imagine getting to Mount Everest and then sitting there and thinking, you want me to climb that? And then start climbing and just after having a breather. And I was smoked at the time as well, so I'd have to have a cig break, as I'm kind of going up the mountain, and then get to the top and then come down. That's not one journey. That's lots of journeys, and that for me is where I think healing comes from. Not necessarily therapy. Healing. Healing is a journey, not a destination. There's something really powerful about that for me. I kind of know where we want to get to, and let's just see what happens along the way.
Can I get the question QR code?
Oh, yeah. Does anybody want to say anything before I do some technical stuff and a whole load of things come on the screen? Come on, don't be nervous. I won't make you enter my Lion King musical. Go for it.
One of my working frustrations is when we are looking at working for really...
Hello.
One of my frustrations is when we are looking at working with a young person that's accessing Tier 4 services. I work very messily because I think it's the best way. You've talked about it now, and it is the only way. The frustration I have is that when you've got somebody that's placed within a Tier 4 service, you don't seem to have a voice, because we can go in and we can explain, what we can offer, how we can do it. But at the end of the day, you don't have a voice, but more importantly, that youngster doesn't have a voice, because you've got very, very senior people making those decisions for that youngster. And we see it all of the time after time. We get told, no, this is what you need to do, this is the risk, this is how you manage the risk. Not on one occasion have I ever been to a meeting with a panel in a Tier 4 service and they've asked the child what they consider to be
But
the risk.
when you say, no, this is how we manage the risk, this is like, what risk are we talking about and whose risk?
Yeah, no, we ask that. I definitely ask it. But
Sure. I mean, like the rest of the people there.
Yeah.
Sorry, could you just explain what a Tier 4 service is?
So Tier 4 is when a youngster has been taken into a service and their choice is removed. So it's a sectioning, basically. So the risk is deemed as so great that somebody else has made the decision that that youngster will go into a place of safety, and they can stay there for up to 28 days whilst an assessment is being undertaken. And then they can stay up there for a matter of months, if not longer, depending on how the service views the need of that youngster. So it was just a point. It was listening to you talking about it being messy, and thinking, yeah, that's exactly how I work, and I enjoy working like that.
Yeah.
But so often we come up against a brick wall with it.
Sure. I think there's something interesting when we talk about risk. I used to work in a needle exchange with both adults and young people. It was the busiest city centre needle exchange outside of London, and we used to always have to reinvent risk consistently, because honestly, some of the things that people came in and asked for and said what they wanted to do, like you couldn't learn that from a book. You just had to be on your feet. You had to understand harm reduction. We weren't ever negating risk. We were giving clean injecting equipment out to people. That's not negating risk. That people can do harm, but it's reducing the harm. And I've always thought the messiness of that is actually quite exciting, and that's just real life.
I think there's a sort of wider thing there around drug use as well, isn't there? And sort of often from the person taking the drugs, then it's a kind of form of self-medication. But as a parent or carer, then it's really hard to kind of to not kind of butt in and be, admonishing and trying to kind of more directly push someone in a particular direction, even though you know that that's not actually going to work from your own experience as a child and, everything else, but you just can't help doing it. So, yeah.
Go for it.
Thank you all so much. So many things to say. Very passionate about this because I think there's something about the structure of systems and funding that hold on to the medicalisation of this model. And I'm so lucky to work in Avon and Somerset with the most extraordinary commissioners who 3 years ago basically let me tear up the model of the greenhouse, which was only a 24-session therapy work with a huge waiting list, to build something led by young people, to work with the messy, to work with the creative arts, to understand that therapy is an incredible resource, but it's not for everybody, and it isn't the only thing that matters. And a cornerstone of that work is supporting parents and carers, because I think so much of the work that we do is it's so important that we take a step back from the ego in the space around the narrative of risk, and all the things that you're saying is critical, because it's the young person's voice that matters, and who in a family where a young person is fortunate enough to have a parent or carer who truly loves them and wants them to heal, who is able to then have the person behind them that can hold on to them. Therapy services, even a 24-session model, is 24 hours a day. Parents and carers are there 365 days a year. So I would love to hear more from Mia, if it's okay. And then your reflections on the importance of that, because the work with parents and carers is critical to managing risk. And so many models across the country, particularly for children and young people, are so focused still on therapy being the only thing, and the lack of parent and carer support is shocking.
Mia?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there, and I mean, even today has just been a real testament to the power of creative approaches with and approaches that empower parents. And you know, we've seen one of the things that really touched me today is like the really closeness of relationships between a parent and a child, talking about how they got help or how they recovered or how they've explored their experience. You know, rather than a child on their own talking about going through the system, which is what I've more commonly seen or come up across. So having that kind of close relationship with a parent is so fundamental to healing, and it's such a gift. And maybe it's something that's more common in this generation than previous generations. I don't know. Maybe that's like an improvement over time. But there's also for anxiety, there's a lot of evidence that interventions that educate parents about anxiety are as important as interventions that work directly with children, you know, giving the 10 sessions of CBT or whatever it is. So parents can be really powerful healers. They're and they can also, they're just essential to the healing. It's a sensitive one, but parents can also be part of the problem. If we think about just particular parenting styles or neglectful parenting or absent parenting, and that's something that inspired me actually around Fatherly, was that speaking to kids from both middle-class backgrounds and from very disadvantaged backgrounds, saying, I never get to see my dad, whether it's because dad's at work because he's a banker or an architect, or because dad doesn't have contact with the family. It was really apparent all these kids just wanted more contact with their dads, and obviously those are dads that have not been involved in any kind of abuse. And it's obviously very different if there's kind of an abusive, if there's some kind of relations of abuse there. So obviously we have to be careful not to generalise, but not just a family approach, but also like next level up. So wider family, grandparents can be really important, aunties, step-parents, carers, and then also community. Again, we've seen it today, being involved in community activities, making a film, feeling like the community cares, and there's a space where people know your name and they care about you, or they remember your story. So all those things are really powerful. Probably a lot of people know there's sort of Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model, where you have these sort of rings around the child, and the child is in the centre, and sort of around them is their parents, and then there's the family, and then there's school, and then there's the community. But then there's also the wider socio-economic and historical settings. So, like you were just saying, you're very lucky in that you've got brilliant commissioners that fund brilliant things, and then in other places there's CAMHS that are really struggling, where there's CAMHS and nothing else, right?
So can I add, because I work in a specialist service and co-facilitate parent courses, so just very quickly, and I think what is so profound is the parents in the space want to do so much for the young person. I think the most important thing we can offer parents is for them to hold on to hope when their child can't, is to give them something to hold on to, because it's not the responsibility of the child at that time of disclosure to hold on to hope if they are struggling. But what can you give a parent in courses that they can hold on to something other than the terror of what their child is going through and the trauma? So I'm so passionate about parents, and parents that care and want to make a difference. For me is everything. And I know Dan.
I was just going to say, like, Dan as the parent on the panel, officially.
Yeah.
I just, one thing that you mentioned, Mia, anxiety. I think anxiety is just like, I think it, it pervades our family, partly. There's quite a lot of sertraline being taken and stuff like that. And also siblings are really important as well. And in our case, one of my child's siblings knew quite a long time before the rest of us what had happened, because he disclosed to them, and they had to kind of live with that. And again, back to CAMHS, after the hospital admission, we had an immediate referral to CAMHS on the ward, but there was literally nothing they could offer at all, except the fact that the person who was, intervening was doing a master's in family therapy, and so said, well, as part of that, we could do some family therapy. So we did the family therapy, but clearly because some people in the family that knew what had happened, and other people in the family really didn't have a clue what had happened, other than the fact that one of them had tried to take their life, then it didn't really help that much. But so I think that kind of, and then obviously, that other child, risks being kind of racked with guilt because did they make the right decision? How did they? Yeah. So that's been a whole other thing, kind of, managing that, helping them manage that burden, and reassuring them that, the issue is, the thing I'm proud of is that they made a decision about what to do, rather than whether, I don't care whether they made the right decision or not. That's not a question I'm addressing. And then also, I think one of the big things I've learned as a parent from the group parent sessions before the voice group was the kind of just trauma, and how that kind of really, really blocks the way that you makes people behave in a way that is not expected to you as a kind of observer, and so kind of just working with that has been really interesting. And then just one other question, outside of kind of abuse and all of that, but sort of decades ago, I was listening to a podcast about the adventure playground movement that was sort of founded on waste spaces after the Second World War, and there was a lot of reminiscences from people about how free it was, and how much choice the people leading the groups had, and all of that. And then also in another kind of church group that I'm involved with, there was a bemoaning of the fact that we can't do those things that we used to do because now we're so constrained by safeguarding rules and all of that. And so, I don't know, the question is, how do we, given this sort of more encompassing perspective on risk, how do we kind of facilitate and allow that kind of freedom, but at the same time be kind of less risky than perhaps things were in the 70s or 80s?
I've got a few thoughts on that, but just before I chip in, let's Cara, let me start with you. So, a question: what would you say to commissioners who are designing services based more on financial restrictions than on responding to the needs of young people? What do you think commissioners need to know?
I think allowing voluntary sector, third sector organisations more themselves more autonomy and more choice around where they spend their money, and having longer term funding something that's always going to be more important. Having funding that lasts 1 to 2 years means that we're forever in this cycle of trying to chase money to ensure that the services that we've spent time developing and we know are impactful and we know make a difference are then funded kind of longer term. And you have to kind of then change the aims or the focus in order to fit with the funding, rather than making sure that the beneficiaries and the end service users and clients, and in this case children and young people, individuals, rather than them getting the best service designed with them and with people who have supported them and know what is necessary and what's needed, you have a situation where funders are saying, we want this service and we'll give you money for it, when there's not often a lot of evidence or a lot of ideas around whether that's actually going to work in practice. So I think commissioners should talk with specialist organisations about, before they put out funding opportunities, around whether things will actually work, whether they'll work for the money that they say that they will, or that they're offering, because that's another frustration. Is it's great if they want a particular service, but if they're not going to fund it to the level that is needed, then it's setting things up to fail. I could really go on with this question. I've got quite a lot of things I would say to commissioners. So I will leave it there and see if anyone else has anything else to add.
Do you have anything?
I would just say try and involve a steering group of young people as well, because young people, in my experience, are really informed around what sounds like something that might work, or something that they would want to be involved with, or something that they, are deeply suspicious of. And I think they can really, really improve the quality of interventions that are put out there. To your point, rather than people discovering things don't work.
I think I chip in here and say that if we're starting designing services from the point of view of how much money have we got, then we need to be realistic about what we are going to be delivering. We know, as of last week, the closure of NHS England. We know that ICBs across the country. For those people that don't know what ICB is, it's basically the health board that decide what is commissioned and what's not commissioned in your area. ICBs being cut by 50%. In my own area, in Greater Manchester, we had 263. I think it was priorities, and as of yesterday they've been cut by, I think it's 180. So we're already deciding the priorities. Well, what's really a priority? And that's coming from a financial point of view. It's the reality of the situation, but then we also have to accept then we can't meet the demand. It's kind of that simple, really. Do you want a microphone, or do you want to just bomb it loud?
Just bomb it.
Go on then.
So, Gemma, you were going to say this.
I'll give you a microphone just in case.
Hiya. I'm a commissioner, so I thought I'd better just put my hand up and say,
Get her! I'm joking.
Get out! And a couple of things really. There is a danger of creating a kind of them and us.
Yeah, without doubt.
And that's so stupid. We're really, we're not. And I think commissioners, if they're working well, are partners in all of this. And certainly we're not the ones that should be designing the services. Nonsense. We maybe are able to provide access to funding led by what the services and the people who use those services say they need. And of course we have to be able to have some grown-up conversations and be pragmatic about what's possible, because there is not the amount of money that we would all want.
Yeah.
And there will always be more demand than we can meet. Yeah, and that is a sadness and a regret amongst commissioners as much as it is amongst the providers, yeah? So I guess what I'm saying is let's work together. What we need is that knowledge. We do need some evidence, because people aren't going to give us the money without some sort of proof and insight and everything. And that's as much about voices as it is about numbers. And I'm really sorry about all that data collection, because yes, it is as absolute bollocks as you all think it is, and I'm really sorry. But we need some of that, because some of the people up there that are making the decisions about who gets money, brutally, we'll look at those figures first, and then we get a bit of an emotional kind of half Nelson on them by telling some stories, yeah? But let's work together to make sure that that gets through,
Yeah.
okay? So we can be facilitators, not enemies.
I wholly agree. I think, yes. I think it's less, sometimes it's less about the commissioner and it's about the system that's been set up. The best thing to do is if we all just press pause, completely dismantle the system and then rebuild something new. Because anybody in their right mind that would build a system the way we have it now, like as of today, I mean, that's bonkers. We just wouldn't. And so commissioners themselves, I think, absolutely, everything you're saying, I think commissioners themselves are desperate. On the whole, I think they're desperate to be invited to the table to talk about what's needed in order to... It kind of makes your job easier as well. If you've got the experts, young people, etc. at the table, then it makes the job slightly easier. I think the system fails all of us in that respect. And I also think it sets us up to be a them and us. Yeah, go.
Well, I just wanted to defend evidence a little bit. Evidence and data. Any other data nerds? No. Okay. Just because I think the intention behind sort of RCTs and collecting evidence is that you could provide to a child, just like you wouldn't give an antibiotic to your child if you knew it hadn't been tested. The whole idea is you wouldn't give a mental health intervention to your child if you didn't know that it was safe to use with your child. So that's where all this whole sort of intense focus on, it comes from a good intention of wanting to give children the best, or adults, the best things that we have. But there's this whole thing of, is it evidence of absence or an absence of evidence? Which is for some of these great things like making a film or doing pottery or whatever, there's just a lack of studies on those kind of interventions, even though for some people, there are some studies, but there's not thousands of studies, right? Whereas on CBT, there's actually thousands of studies, yeah. Right? So then what happens is sometimes people will choose the CBT over the pottery because it's got more evidence. But my experience is the more that you publicise, shout about, newspaper articles, blogs of the success stories of the things that aren't the standard evidence-based, those catch on, and commissioners want to do those things because the public speaks for itself as well. So I just think there is a lot of, I really believe in like dissemination, qualitative research, just sharing good practice, putting it online, and it will also spread. Like a while ago, there was classes for dads to learn how to plait their kids' hair. Actually, the bits of your nail polish and learn how to manicure could be.
Do you know I've got painted nails? Has anyone mentioned it?
Callback. But yeah, so and that just spread across the country. It was just one person, one hairdresser that started doing it, and then it spread around the whole country. And so things can also spread organically because parents, schools are looking for solutions. They're looking for things to just buy and do, which is, I think, really encouraging.
Cara, do you want to say something?
Yeah, it's just a couple of things. I think in terms of commissioners, it is very much that I've worked with some absolutely fantastic commissioners, and I've worked with some funding bodies that are amazing and really bring a lot to the voluntary sector and understand the needs of services. And I've worked with commissioners that haven't so much. That's what I'll say. And I think one of the biggest differences is where there is a very evident power imbalance, and I think that again gets mirrored. So if there's a real power imbalance between the commissioners and the organisation, that has a negative impact on the service that they're delivering, and that's where we see it. So when we have commissioners who want to have those discussions, who want to be more flexible and say, you know, this is what our end goal is, and the end goal is the same, then that works really well, and you dismantle that idea that we're telling you this is what you have to do and this is how you have to spend the money. That's where you see a real negative impact. And just bringing back to your point around interventions and particularly very kind of tier 4 top level interventions, again, where there's real kind of power dynamics, that's where we see it kind of mirrored again across kind of different services, and we see that real impact. And one of the things I worked in the public sector for a very short amount of time because I realised very quickly that it wasn't for me because of the confines. I love working in the voluntary sector, I love working in the third sector. I think we have a huge amount of flexibility and opportunity, and a lot of that is down to commissioning and funding, and being more flexible. And I think that part of the reason for that is because that there is less of a power imbalance in the people that we support, and the way that we do it, because we're not confined in the same way with kind of regulations and rules and structures and boundaries that can really create a disconnect and a discourse between the people. And bringing it back to kind of risk management, a lot of that is around the risk or the kind of potential for risk. So I think, and especially with survivors of abuse, you know, taking the power dynamics and looking at the system of, you know, who's got the power, who's got the control, and how do you redress that balance, that's where you're going to start to see like a huge impact on people feeling that they can engage with those services. And just in terms of kind of research, now I'm somebody, evidence-based, I think it's really, really important, but I do think that we sometimes get a bit of a vicious cycle where a intervention will be successful, there'll be a whole load of research around it, and then that becomes the only thing that's available, and other things don't get the attention or the research.
And also sometimes we need to not have an evidence base, just someone go, this looks like it really works, let's have a go, let's do some testing, let's see, and build up the evidence.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion. I was just thinking on the evidence-based practice, like from a public health perspective, there's another element that we haven't mentioned. So there's what's the evidence base, there's what the young people or, you know, service users will experience, and then there's the clinical expertise or like the service provider experience. And I think that's something that we haven't named in this conversation yet, is that obviously, like, we don't also want, we want to be really mindful of this kind of like, oh, it's not, I don't want to, you know, what was the phrase you used, Duncan? The kind of like, it's not worth my, I don't want to take this risk because
I think I said covering your ass.
Thank you. So we want to be mindful of that, but we also want to be mindful of the fact that we want good people to want to stay in these services. We want people who have got lived experience or come from different backgrounds to feel like they're safe and supported. And so we're not, it has to work for the clinicians and the service providers as well. And that's where you've got that sweet spot in the middle of the Venn diagram, right, when all three of those things are, and that is going to be a movable feast depending on, like you say, the different service.
There's a bit of a culture change in that as well, making sure that everybody's on board. You've got to have the service, you've got to have the young people, you've got to have the outside consultants, researchers, you've got to have the commissioners. Everybody's got to be at the table with the same intention. And we might arrive at the destination on a few different journeys, but we've all got to kind of get there. before... Marvellous. Like Annika Rice on Treasure Hunt. Yeah. That's a reference to the oldies in the room.
I've never used one of these before. I'm not responding directly to the last comments, but a few words have been coming up for me, and that's like, how do we add meaning to things? And I think that's come up in relation to commissioning as well. Is like, I think data's important, but actually, how do we make sure that what we're doing with the money is meaningful? And that's not always reflected in the data. And I'm sort of coming back to the kind of values that we have around it. It's almost what's wrong with our economy as well. It's like, how do we judge what is valuable in society? So the word meaning has been coming up to me, but also going back to risk, like the fact that we're kind of talking here about risk. What we're actually talking about is young people and their thoughts around their existence, what it is to not be here, what it is to be here, and how we as humanity, like throughout the centuries, have dealt with those thoughts around existence, and it's to create meaning in lives. So it's not necessary, and as therapists, I'm a therapist, that's kind of what the role in the
sorry
therapy...
about that.
That's what the role in the therapy room is how do you create meaning, and how do young people work to create meaning for themselves? And I think sometimes we make it sound more complicated than it is, talking about risk, and more scary than it is, but actually whether or not people have been through a hard time and whether or not they've been abused, like as teenagers, it's a natural thing to be considering your existence, and almost thinking about not being here is thinking about how valuable it is to be here as well. So
Yeah.
that's just what's been coming up for me.
Let's move on from that. And another question. Could the panel explore a pathway of care for Dan's young person that might reflect or promote a healing path? What are the touch points drawing on collective knowledge being shared here today?
This looks like an essay question. Essay question.
In 100 words.
Well, did Papyrus already outline a kind of journey, or?
I suppose I feel slightly uncomfortable with this question because it's not necessarily my information to share. I'm happy to hear what people have to say because that's without what I know, but I just feel I might kind of end up saying too much.
To him as well, to Dan.
But one very general thing I will say is that I think that obviously I think that people are at very different stages. So as someone who witnesses somebody else trying to take their life, it's very immediate and sudden. But as someone who's doing it, often it's something that they've been living with, or the prompt for them to want to do it, they've been living with for a long, long time. And I think in terms of those around someone being able to help them heal, then that kind of massive gap in kind of experience is probably universal and is really important.
I think, just to answer the question but slightly reframe it. So I would say, for me, because I've got this longitudinal study now, so I'm able to kind of go, so when I was 11, 12, 13, what would I have wanted? Because I know what I didn't get, so how would I design it? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think, I was thinking a little bit about what you were just saying before around kind of something about value. And I'm often asked, if somebody would have asked me at the time, are you being abused? Would you have said anything? And I'll be honest with you and I'll say, no, I wouldn't have said anything for two reasons. First reason, I didn't know it was abuse. So the reason I didn't know is because nobody in school, nobody in education, nobody on the TV was talking about me, boys. So I knew that girls, because I remember a story on Grange Hill. I remember that story. There were my cultural references. Just like young people have cultural references now. They were my cultural references, and nobody was talking about boys. So I didn't realise that what was happening to me was abuse. I had no, in research, kind of compare contrast. And so it was donkey's years later that I kind of was like, think I need to rethink that experience and those experiences. And so what would I do now? I think part of a pathway of care, it begins more when we talk about boys with society. We've got to start talking about boys as survivors, as victims, but to even begin to enable boys to have a voice, to enable young men to have a voice, to enable them to go, oh, that's what that's called. And I think part of the reason why I always will say yes to things like this and talk about and kind of say yes to engaging with television, documentaries, soap operas, etc., is to tell the stories. So people begin to understand that it does happen to boys, it does happen to young girls of colour, it does happen in, we were talking before about like Roma communities, it's not just one particular type of person, if that makes sense. So I think part of the pathway, we can all do something about that. We can all make sure that there are conversations that are happening in order to give people the compare contrast, if that makes sense. Next question. Is it possible to find a happy balance between risk management, safeguarding, and freedom, autonomy, and flexibility?
Yes.
Let's start. Yes, let's move on. Cara, come on.
Yes, it is. Because, so thinking about safeguarding, I mean, again, safeguarding is seen as a form of risk management, I suppose, but that isn't ever something that should be done to a person either. They should always be involved in that process and in that journey. So I think it's not even about finding. For me, it's not even about finding a happy balance. It's that autonomy and choice should take priority. So maybe I'm changing my answer to no. I would say no. There isn't,
we're all
because
friends
it should
here.
be,
We can do that.
It should be the other way, because if you're trying to manage risk and safeguard somebody and they're not involved in that, then it's not going to be successful, because you're not offering them safety. You're, again, trying to control a situation that they probably don't have very much control over. It's somebody else trying to control a situation. And although you may be coming from more of a place of concern than a place of harm, it's still trying to control that situation. I worked in domestic abuse services for a number of years, and it's very difficult. And I'm talking more about adults now, but in terms of the people that I supported. But it's very difficult to, as a practitioner sometimes, or a professional, however you describe yourself, sometimes you're thinking about what you think that person needs. And one of the things that I found the most difficult about working in domestic abuse services was that I wanted the women, my role was supporting women due to the particular pathway of support that I was offering. I wanted to pick them up and wrap them up in cotton wool and put them somewhere that I knew that was safe. But I couldn't do that because that wasn't my role. So I would engage with them, I'd offer them support, I'd offer them options, choices. But it was choices, it was their choices. And if their choice was that they were going to leave the interaction that we were having and they were going to go back to a household that was unsafe, where potentially they would be harmed, that was their choice. it was a difficult choice for me to accept. It wasn't what I wanted them to do, but I can't put my interpretation of safety onto them, because I'm just doing what the perpetrator in that household is doing. I'm taking away control, I'm taking away choice. So yeah, I think it's not just that there needs to be a happy balance, but it needs to be the priority.
So just as a show of hands, that kind of, when the question comes up, that kind of gut feeling, binary thinking, yes or no, red peppers or green tomatoes, or whatever it used to be, red tomatoes, green peppers. Everybody that thinks yes, it is possible to find a happy balance, raise your hand. Okay, and no? Apart from that Tinkerbell. Get back to Peter Pan. Okay.
Can I just say one thing as well? So during adolescence, it's just, I mean, everyone will know this, but it's just a natural stage for young people to go out there, take more risks, start doing risky behaviour. Their brain is hardwired for that. Their brain is hardwired to be really influenced by peers, and it's not fully matured. The brain doesn't finish maturing until they're about 24. So around sort of 14, 15, actually, they want to try out new things. They want to leave the home. They want to try out risky things. And it's just part of sort of development and being able to function as an adult is leaving the home, you know, trying out things. And I think Dan was saying before, you know, in today's society, children play out less. You know, we have a much more helicopter parenting. We're much more worried for their safety when we don't know where they are outside of the house. And so what you have now maybe is children and teenagers exploring more sort of the Wild West online and finding their own risks and thrills online rather than in the streets.
Sure.
And so, you know, one sort of way to deal with that is that children and teenagers are deeply influenced by their peers. They're much more influenced by their peers than by us as adults. And so, you know, if we want to try and promote particular behaviours, like don't go on that website or don't do that, they're much more likely to be influenced if their peers are doing the same thing or following the same norms than us telling them what's right or wrong when it comes to risk taking.
So that kind of leads me on to the final question, because I am aware of time. What meaning do young people make of risk and self-harm? So as the only young person in the room, I am so not qualified to say this.
It's a hard question to answer because I think a young person should answer.
Yeah.
And I'm quite sad. I mean, this has been an astounding panel. But I wish there was a young person in the panel or in the audience. And I think, again, similar to Dan, I think we should respect maybe next year or another time is to hear from a young person who's gone through something and they should answer it.
Yeah. Just before that, let me reframe it. What do you see as how do you see young people make sense of risk and self-harm?
So my favourite example is the tattoo, actually, for someone who's almost died by suicide but decided not to, which is the apostrophe. And sometimes parents will also get it as well as their child, as the solidarity or siblings. And if it's on the arm, it's an instant symbol to someone else that they're talking to of what they've been through. I find that really moving, and I think a lot of people are very proud to have that tattoo.
Last comment?
Sorry, it feels like pressure. I think it's about need as well, isn't it? It's meeting the need, understanding all behaviour is communication, and the self-harming behaviour and you know, thoughts of suicide and attempts of suicide are meeting a need for that young person at that point. So it's understanding what the need is behind it, and what you said, Dan, earlier in terms of like with people around that young person, particularly if we're talking about like suicidality and thoughts of suicide. You're so right in terms of it being in different places, so it's understanding where they're at and meeting them where they're at, because it may be that for you it's a massive shock and it's something that they've never talked about, but they will have had those kind of thoughts. So it's how you have those conversations and how you meet them where they're at the point.
Final comment?
I don't think I've got anything to add.
Okay.
Thank you. But thank you, everybody.
I would say that actually, I've just got an itchy buster. I would say that the thing I've noticed, particularly with young men, one of the projects that I set up and we work with is young men at risk of sexual exploitation or young men who are selling sex. And I would say their version of risk is very similar to my version of risk when I was their age, but their version of risk now is very different to my version of risk at my age now. And I think there is an interesting conversation there, because I know my version of risk has drastically changed. So I tripped up the other day and my husband said, "Oh, you nearly had a fall." When do you go from tripping up to nearly having a fall? There's a risk thing in that there somewhere, isn't there? You get to an age and you no longer trip up, you have a fall. I think there's something important in that, joking aside, that actually my understanding of risk is very, very different now than when I was the lads from the Blue Rooms age. And what I want to do is I want to tell them that at the same time as I need to understand that their view of the world is very different than my view of the world now. I don't want to break a hip, you know. That was the last thing I was worried about. I was more worried about not wanting to overdose when I was their age. So, thank you. Thank you so much. Please give a round of applause to the panel.